Hello, everyone. Today's presentation is on natural selection. Let's first begin with talking about the one and only Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is a famous naturalist. He is well known for the work he did on the Galapagos Islands. He studied the many different species that lived on the different islands and compared them to each other. He discovered that they were in fact the same species but had different characteristics, and they did come from an original ancestor that they had in common. Darwin is most known for the study he did on the different species on the Galapagos Islands. He discovered that finches on different islands had beaks that specialized in eating a specific type of food. For example, some finches had beaks that were good for eating seeds, while others had beaks that were suited to eating insects. He came to the conclusion that at one point, all of the finches were a part of the same family and had similar characteristics. He also studied that tortoises on the different islands. As he studied them, he found that the tortoises had different shells, just like how the finches had different beaks. So he came to the same conclusion that the tortoises descended from a common ancestor. As he pieced all of the information together, he came up with his famous theory, the theory of evolution. He concluded that evolution, or change over time, is the process by which modern organisms descended from ancient organisms. So now that we know a little about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, let's talk about natural selection. So what is natural selection? Well, another way to say it is survival of the fittest. This means that individuals with the characteristics best suited for their environment will live and produce offspring with those similar characteristics. This also means that those with worse characteristics will either die off or produce less offspring. Let's use this picture here as an example. Fossil records have proven that there were once giraffes with short necks. But because they lived in an environment where food sources were high up in the trees, the giraffes with short necks eventually died. And now there are only giraffes with long necks. Here's how Darwin explained it. It is not the strongest of the species that survived, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Now let's break it down a little further. Darwin broke natural selection into 4 different steps. The first is overproduction. The second, variation. The third, competition. And the fourth is selection. So what is overproduction? Well, overproduction is when a species produces more offspring than can survive. An example of this is the runt of a litter. The runt is usually the smallest and weakest of the litter, and the mother usually rejects that individual, and they can't survive without her, so that individual dies and doesn't get to pass its characteristics down to the next generation. Now that we understand the first step, let's move on to the second. Variation. Variation is that each individual has a unique combination of inherited characteristics. Look to this picture for an example. The litter of puppies is very diverse in their political characteristics. Each puppy looks different from the other puppies. And it's important to remember that the more variation of types of species in the habitat, the more likely that species will be able to survive. Now on to the third step. Competition. Competition is where individuals need to compete for the limited amount of resources in their environment. These resources include food, water, space, and mates. This is where survival of the fittest shows the most. Some individuals with the best traits for survival and to reach resources first are the ones more likely to survive. And now on to the final step, and that is selection. Selection is where the individual with the best traits survive and have the opportunity to pass their traits to their offspring. Take this Arctic fox, for example. There are many species of foxes, and I commonly think of foxes as red or orange. But this species of fox evolved through natural selection to have a white coat so that it can camouflage with the snow, while the other foxes with orange or red coats would stand out and be found by their predators. So now that we know how natural selection works and how it plays a role in evolution, it is also important to note that evolution does not happen quickly, but it happens across several generations and to the entire population, not just a single individual. To go along with natural selection, there's also artificial selection. Artificial selection is the identification by humans of desired traits in plants and animals, and they've taken steps to enhance and perpetuate those traits in future generations. The most common example of artificial selection is in dogs. Everywhere you look, there are dozens of different breeds of dogs. There are retrievers, Dalmatians, German Shepherds, Chihuahuas, Pugs, Pit Bulls, and countless more. All of these different breeds came from the domestication of the wolf and the breeding of wolves with the same desired characteristics. Unlike natural selection, artificial selection is nearly completely controlled by humans. However, and this is important to note, natural selection is and cannot be controlled by anyone. The individuals with the best traits live and reproduce, while those with the worst traits die off. It is purely the process of elimination through survival of the fittest. Thank you for watching, and if you would like to learn more, here are the references I used.